The linen is the first thing you'd notice, white, pristine, and smelling of expensive myrrh. But as you move closer to the heart of the royal palace at Medinet Habu, the scent of spice is replaced by the metallic tang of fresh blood. The year is 1155 BC. The pharaoh Ramesses III, a living god on earth, is slumped in his chair. His throat hasn't just been cut, it has been carved. A jagged, 3-inch wound that severed his esophagus and reached back to the bone. This isn't the work of a foreign assassin or a battlefield enemy. This was done by the people who shared his most intimate hours, the women of the Kenere, the royal harem. Behind the heavy cedar doors, the silence is more terrifying than the screams. Dozens of women, once the most envied in the world, are realizing that the impossible has happened. They have killed a god. But the divine order of Egypt is a machine that doesn't stop for a corpse. Outside, the palace guards are already moving. The conspirators are trapped. This isn't just a story of a royal murder. It is the account of a systemic nightmare that history tried to bury. For the women involved, the blade across the pharaoh's throat was their only hope, because what awaited them in the aftermath of failure was a fate so psychologically devastating and physically grotesque that death would have been a mercy. We aren't talking about simple executions. We are talking about the clinical erasure of the human soul. You've been told the harem was a place of luxury. You've been told these women were lucky. You were lied to. And today, we are going to look at the evidence that was hidden, the mummies that were left screaming in their tombs, and the terrifying legal records that prove what happened to these concubines was far worse than anything you've ever imagined. There is a version of history that doesn't appear in the history books. It's the version where the beautiful ones, the concubines of the pharaoh, weren't celebrated icons of beauty, but high-value political prisoners. To understand the horror that unfolded in 1155 BC, we first have to dismantle the myth of the harem. The Western mind hears the word harem and thinks of a Hollywood-set silk pillows, flowing wine, and idle luxury. But the Egyptian term was the kanera. It translates more accurately to the enclosure, or the restricted place. It wasn't a room, it was a city-state within the palace, a high-security institution designed for one purpose, the absolute containment of female reproductive power for the benefit of a single man. The illusion of choice. Imagine being a 15-year-old girl in a distant province, or a conquered territory like Canaan or Nubia. Your beauty isn't a gift, it's a tax. The pharaoh's officials, the overseers of the House of Women, traveled the empire like talent scouts for a nightmare. If you were chosen, you weren't married to the king, you were brought. You became property of the state, recorded on papyrus scrolls alongside cattle and grain shipments. Once you passed through the gates of the Kenere at Miware, the world you knew ceased to exist. You were given a new name. Your old family was forbidden from contacting you. You were now living in a golden cage, but the bars were made of social obligation and religious terror, the bureaucracy of beauty. Inside, life was governed by a clinical, suffocating schedule. Every hour was accounted for. The concubines were trained in music, dance, and the ways of the palace, but make no mistake, this was a manufacturing plant for royal influence. They produced the linen that the pharaoh wore. They sang the songs that maintained his divinity. And they waited. Some women would go years without ever seeing the pharaoh. They lived in a state of perpetual intimate readiness for a man who might not know their names. This created a psychological pressure cooker. Imagine hundreds of women, all highly educated, all politically connected, trapped in a small geographic space, with their entire survival dependent on the whim of a single aging ruler. The first open loop. But here is where the story gets dark. The Kenere was supposed to be the safest place in the world. It was guarded by the overseer of the gate room, a man whose sole job was to ensure no one entered or left without the pharaoh's seal. Yet, archaeological evidence from the Gurob harem site shows something strange: secret tunnels, hidden caches of magic wax figures, and a series of letters that suggest the women weren't just singing, they were plotting. Why would women, who had everything, the finest food, the best jewelry, the protection of a god, risk it all to commit the ultimate sin of regicide? The answer lies in the house of the recluse. Because the Kenera wasn't just a home for the young, it was a graveyard for the old. If a pharaoh died and you hadn't secured the future of your son, you didn't just lose your status, you disappeared. Queen Tiye, a minor wife of Ramesses III, looked at her son, Prince Pentawere, and realized he would never sit on the throne. She looked at the aging pharaoh and saw a man who had outlived his usefulness. She didn't just want power, she wanted to avoid the erasure that awaited every concubine who failed to become the mother of a king. She began to whisper, and the whispers turned into the most documented conspiracy in ancient history. But as we'll see, the judicial papyrus of Turin reveals that the conspirators didn't just use daggers. They used something far more terrifying in the eyes of the Egyptians: dark magic. And that is where the real horror begins. Because when you try to kill a god with magic, the punishment isn't just for your body, it's for your eternity. To the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was not just a man. He was the Mart, the literal anchor of cosmic order. To strike him was to invite the collapse of the universe. Yet, inside the stone walls of the Medinet Habu harem, Queen Ta and her circle of concubines were doing the unthinkable. They were engineering a divine assassination. But they didn't start with daggers. They started with the mind, the weapons of the weak. In a society where women were denied physical weapons, the concubines turned to the only power that could bypass a palace guard: Hekau, or magic. The judicial papyrus of Turin reveals a chilling detail that historians once dismissed as superstition, but which we now understand as psychological warfare. The conspirators smuggled out secret scrolls from the royal library, texts containing forbidden spells designed to enfeeble the limbs of the palace protectors. They crafted small wax figurines, known as voodoo-like effigies, modelled after the pharaoh's elite guards and Ramesses himself. Under the flickering light of oil lamps in the inner chambers, the women would chant incantations, melting the wax or piercing it with bronze needles. This wasn't just ritual. It was a way to build a collective conspiracy of silence among the harem staff. If you participated in the magic, you were bound to the murder. The secret network of the gate room. The conspiracy required a bridge between the isolated golden cage and the outside world. This bridge was the overseer of the gate room and the royal butlers. These were men who had daily access to the concubines and the pharaoh's private table. Queen Ta used her influence and promise of future titles to turn these men into couriers. They carried messages hidden in jars of wine and baskets of linen to the men of the outside, military officers and local officials who were ready to revolt the moment the god was proven mortal. The plan was clinical, a two-pronged attack. An external rebellion would distract the army, while the internal strike would occur in the one place the pharaoh felt safest: his bed. The strike and the screaming revelation. The night of the assassination was likely a festival night, a time of noise and celebration that would drown out a struggle. We now know from forensic CT scans of Ramesses III mummy that the attack was multi-directional. Someone struck from the front with a heavy blade, while another potentially attacked from behind. The pharaoh died instantly, but the conspirators failed in their most crucial goal. They didn't seize the throne before the crown prince, Ramesses IV, could react. This brings us to the most haunting piece of evidence in this entire mystery: the screaming mummy, also known as Unknown Man E, found in a hidden cache at Deir el-Bahari. This mummy was not prepared with the usual care. He wasn't eviscerated. His organs were left to rot inside him. He was wrapped in ritually unclean sheepskin, an abomination to the Egyptians, and his face is frozen in a wide-mouthed, agonizing scream. For decades, he was a cold case, but DNA analysis has finally closed the loop. He is the son of Ramesses III. He is Prince Pentawere, the very man the concubines tried to put on the throne. His face is the physical manifestation of the failure of the conspiracy. But as we're about to explore, his quick death by forced suicide was the merciful part of the pharaoh's justice. For the women, the concubines who instigated the plot, the nightmare was only beginning. The new pharaoh didn't just want them dead, he wanted them to suffer a social and eternal death that would make the screaming mummy's fate look like a blessing. Once the blade had fallen and the pharaoh Ramesses III was cold, the machinery of the Egyptian state did not collapse. It recalibrated with a terrifying, clinical precision. The conspirators had succeeded in killing the man, but they had failed to kill the institution. The new pharaoh, Ramesses IV, now faced a crisis of divinity. How do you punish people who have proven that a god can bleed? The answer was the trial of the harem conspiracy, a legal proceeding recorded on the judicial papyrus of Turin that reveals a psychological cruelty far deeper than physical torture. To an ancient Egyptian, your name, your ren, was one of the 5 essential parts of your soul. If your name was spoken or written, you existed in the afterlife. If it was erased, you suffered the second death, an eternal, non-existence that was the ultimate Egyptian nightmare. Before the trial even began, the court stripped the concubines and their co-conspirators of their identities. Instead, the scribes used monstrous aliases. One official is renamed Meredre, meaning Re shall hate him. Another is called Binemweze, or the Evil One, in Thebes. By renaming them, the state was performing a legal exorcism, cutting them off from the land of the living and the dead before the first witness was even called. The trial was not held in a public square, but in a closed, high-security setting. Ramesses IV appointed 12 high-ranking officials to act as judges, but he gave them a chilling instruction. Regarding the matters which the people have spoken, I do not know them. Go and examine them. This was a classic move of political distancing. By claiming ignorance, the pharaoh remained pure, while the judges were given the authority to become the architects of the conspirators' agony. The worse-than-death aspect began here. For the lower-ranking members of the harem, the servants and minor concubines, the punishment was mutilation. They were not simply executed. Their noses and ears were surgically removed. They were forbidden from covering their faces, forced to live as a permanent, visible reminder of the pharaoh's wrath. Imagine the psychological devastation. Every time you look in a mirror, or at another person, you are reminded of your treason. You are a living corpse, rejected by society, waiting for a death that has already taken your dignity. But the darkness of the trial didn't stop with the defendants. During the proceedings, a secondary scandal erupted, one that history tried to bury even deeper. Several of the judges, the men appointed to represent the pharaoh's justice, were caught partying and consorting with the very concubines they were supposed to be trying. This reveals the terrifying power these women still held, even in chains. They weren't just victims, they were master manipulators who used their bodies and their status as a last-ditch effort to survive. When the pharaoh found out, he didn't hesitate. The judges themselves were subjected to the same nasal mutilation as the criminals. This act turned the courtroom into a slaughterhouse of status. As the trial reached its peak, the focus shifted to the highest-ranking conspirators, Queen Ta and her son, Pentuer. For them, mutilation wasn't enough. The state required something more definitive. But there was a problem. In Egypt, you could not legally execute a member of the royal family without risking a blood curse on the land. So, the court devised a solution that was far more sinister than an axe to the neck. They forced the royals to become their own executioners. They were left to their own devices in a locked room. What happened in those rooms? And why does the physical evidence of Pentuer's body, the screaming mummy, contradict the clean story of a forced suicide? As we move into the next section, we'll look at the forensic evidence that suggests the suicide was actually a slow, agonizing ritual of suffocation that left a prince screaming for eternity, while the linguistic erasure of the trial stripped the conspirators of their souls. The physical treatment of Prince Pentuer's body was designed to ensure he remained in a state of perpetual agony. This is the story of Unknown Man E, the archaeological anomaly that horrified the world when it was first unwrapped in 1886. In the Egyptian view of the afterlife, the preservation of the body was a sacred science. To be mummified was to be perfected for eternity. But for the prince who would be king, the state performed an anti-mummification ritual. When archaeologists found Unknown Man E, they were struck by a smell that had survived 3 millennia, the stench of rot mixed with resin. Unlike royal mummies, he had not been eviscerated. His brain and internal organs were left inside to liquefy, a process that usually results in the total destruction of the corpse. More disturbingly, he was not wrapped in fine linen, he was rolled in a sheepskin. To the Egyptians, sheepskin was ritually unclean, a material associated with the enemies of Egypt, and the god Seth, the lord of chaos. By wrapping a prince in this hide, the priests were effectively placing him in a spiritual straitjacket, telling the gods that this man was not a child of the Nile, but a creature of filth. It was a deliberate attempt to bar him from the Hall of Ma'at. For a century, the myth persisted that Pentuer had been buried alive. The wide-open mouth, the strained tendons in the neck, and the look of pure terror on the face suggested a man gasping for his last breath inside a sarcophagus. However, modern CT scans and forensic analysis have revealed a truth that is, in many ways, even more calculated. The analysis of the neck tissue shows evidence of strangulation. Because the court allowed him to take his own life to preserve the royal bloodline from an official executioner. It is likely that Pentuer was forced to hang himself or was throttled by palace butlers in a staged suicide. But the scream wasn't just a byproduct of death. Usually, the jaw of a mummy is bound shut to maintain a peaceful, dignified expression. They wanted his physical form to reflect the state of his treacherous heart for all time. The final blow wasn't the sheepskin or the strangulation, it was the erasure from time. In the temple of Medinet Habu, where the victories of Ramesses III are carved in stone, the names of the conspirators were chiseled away. This is known as damnatio memoriae. If you visited the temple after the trial, you would see blank spaces where royal figures once stood. To the Egyptian mind, if your name is chiseled out and your body is wrapped in filth, you never existed, you are a hole in the universe. While Prince Pentuer was left as a physical monument to agony, the fate of the high-ranking concubines, led by Queen Tiye, involved a more sophisticated form of psychological annihilation. In the aftermath of the trial, the Egyptian state enacted what historians refer to as a House of Oblivion protocol. For these women, the punishment wasn't a quick end. It was a slow, deliberate descent into a life where they were treated as though they had already ceased to exist. For the most powerful women of the Kenere, an official execution was often avoided to prevent the creation of political martyrs. Instead, they were subjected to a lifelong silence decree. These women were moved from the luxurious quarters of the palace to isolated, high-security chambers within the temple complexes or remote harem outposts like Miweh. They were forbidden from speaking to any guard or servant. Their names were never to be uttered by anyone in the empire under penalty of death. Imagine the psychological devastation of a queen who once commanded thousands, now spending decades in a stone cell, hearing the world move on outside while she remained a living ghost. This was the clinical application of damnatio memoriae to a living person. Archaeological excavations in the Valley of the Queens have revealed a terrifying physical manifestation of this policy: the Wall of Nameless Women. While royal tombs are usually covered in elaborate biographies and prayers, a specific subset of shafts from the 20th dynasty tells a different story. These tombs contain multiple female mummies, but the walls are blank. The cartouches, the oval frames meant to hold royal names, have been left empty or were never carved at all. In the Egyptian worldview, entering the afterlife without a name on your tomb was like trying to navigate a desert without eyes. These women were buried in silence, their identities surgically removed from the stone, ensuring that even in the spirit world, they would wander as the nameless. But why this level of extreme, multi-generational cruelty? To understand this, we have to look past the surface narrative of punishment and look at the universal truth of pharaonic power. The pharaoh didn't just want to kill his enemies, he wanted to prove that his enemies never happened. By erasing the women, he restored the illusion of Ma'at, the perfect, undisturbed divine order. Every 8 to 10 minutes in this investigation, we hit a new layer of horror. We've seen the physical wound on the pharaoh's neck. We've seen the screaming face of the prince. But now, we are looking at the invisible loops of the Egyptian legal system. The state was so terrified of the concubines' influence that they even targeted the women's families. Records suggest that the siblings and parents of the evil ones were stripped of their land and forced into labor camps in the turquoise mines of Sinai, a death sentence in all but name. The worse-than-death fate was a virus that infected everyone the concubines had ever loved. For the minor concubines, servants, and the lower-ranking guards involved in the harem conspiracy, the state did not grant the mercy of a swift execution. Instead, the Egyptian court utilized a form of biological branding, known as nasal and oral amputation. This was the clinical application of social horror. In ancient Egyptian culture, the face was the mirror of the soul. The nose, in particular, was vital. It was the conduit of breath, and in many religious texts, the ability to breathe was synonymous with the favor of the gods. When the pharaoh's executioners took a bronze blade to a concubine's nose, they weren't just disfiguring her, they were symbolically suffocating her social existence. The procedure was performed with calculated precision. The judicial papyrus of Turin notes that these punishments were carried out on the spot once the verdict was reached. The removal of the nose and ears transformed the beautiful ones into grotesque reminders of the pharaoh's power. They were then cast out of the palace gates. Imagine walking the streets of Thebes or Memphis with a smooth, scarred hole where your nose once was. In a world obsessed with aesthetic perfection and divine symmetry, these women became immediate outcasts. They were the marked. No temple or noble house would hire a noseless woman, as her presence was considered a spiritual pollutant. They were often forced into the city's fringes, living in shanties or among the unclean occupations like leather tanning or waste removal. Because their names had been stripped during the trial, they could not even identify themselves to old friends. They were forced to respond to the derogatory nicknames given to them by the public. This was the worse than death reality. You were alive enough to feel the hunger, the heat, and the scorn, but dead enough that no one would ever look you in the eye again. The horror reached a peak of dark irony when the judges themselves were caught in the scandal. As mentioned in the master outline, 3 of the 12 judges, men of the highest status, were found to have consorted with the women during the trial. The Pharaoh did not distinguish between the conspirator and the corrupt judge. These men, who had walked into the court as the hand of the king, walked out as noseless pariahs, forced to live in the same gutters as the women they had been sent to condemn. It was a total collapse of the Egyptian social order. This brings us back to Prince Pentawere. Why was he allowed suicide while these others were mutilated? It was a matter of blood. To mutilate a prince was to mutilate the pharaoh's own lineage. The screaming mummy was treated with spiritual filth, the sheepskin, but his physical face remained intact, a final, cruel honor that only served to preserve his look of terror for eternity. In the dry, unforgiving outskirts of the Theban necropolis lies a collection of pits that were never meant to be found. While the pharaohs rested in gold and the queens in painted limestone, the marked ones, the concubines who survived the mutilation, were eventually discarded in what archaeologists call the non-elite communal shafts. But it is here, in these dark holes, that we find the most heartbreaking evidence of their struggle against the pharaoh's curse. When archaeologists excavated these mass graves, they found something that defied the official death of these women's identities. Several of the mummies, confirmed through osteological analysis to have had their noses surgically removed during life, were found with prosthetic reconstructions. These weren't the high-quality gold masks of the elite. These were desperate, DIY attempts to cheat the gods. In the gaps where their noses had been, the women, or perhaps the few family members who remained loyal in secret, had packed the void with wax, linen, and resin to mold a false nose before the final burial. This was an act of extreme spiritual rebellion. By fixing their faces in death, they were trying to bypass the divine gatekeepers, who would surely reject a marked soul. They were attempting to walk into eternity with a face the pharaoh had commanded to be destroyed. Even more chilling was the discovery of inscribed shards tucked inside the linen wrappings of these nameless women. Despite the linguistic erasure decree of the trial, where their names were officially changed to monstrous aliases like the Evil One, some women were buried with small pieces of limestone, ostraca, featuring their original birth names. These were hidden like contraband. It suggests a secret network of survivors who refused to let the pharaoh fully erase their humanity. They knew that if the gods could see their true names, the damnatio memoriae would fail. At this point, we have moved from the grand political stage of the harem conspiracy to the intimate, microscopic horror of a woman trying to glue a piece of wax to her face so she can exist in the next life. This transition highlights the total reach of pharaonic power. It didn't just rule the kingdom. It attempted to rule the very shape of your physical and spiritual reflection. But what of the men who let this happen, the overseers of the gate room, who were supposed to be the locks on the cage? The records show they didn't just fail, they were erased, with a violence that makes nasal mutilation look like a warning. By this point, the physical bodies of the concubines were either rotting in nameless pits or marked with the scars of the pharaoh's justice. But for the Egyptian state, killing the body was only half the battle. To truly neutralize the evil ones, the state had to launch a war in the spiritual realm, a process known as magical execution. The most terrifying weapon in the pharaoh's arsenal wasn't the bronze sword, but the execration text. Scribes would take red pottery the color of the god Seth, the deity of chaos and blood, and inscribe the names, or the monstrous aliases created during the trial, of the conspirators onto the clay. The ritual was clinical and cold. In a temple ceremony, a priest would read the names aloud, essentially summoning the soul of the conspirator into the pottery. Then, with a sudden, violent strike, the pottery was smashed into 1,000 pieces. This wasn't just symbolic. It was believed to physically shatter the person's ka, their life force, in the afterlife. For the concubines who had tried to reconstruct their faces with wax, this was the ultimate countermeasure. No matter how much wax you used, you couldn't fix a soul that had been magically pulverized by a priest of a moon. Beyond smashing pottery, the state utilized execration figurines. These were small, crude statues of bound prisoners, often made of clay or wax, with their hands tied behind their backs. The names of Queen Tia's inner circle were carved into the chests of these dolls. These figures were then stabbed with bronze pins, burned, or buried upside down near the tombs of the loyal dead. The goal was to hunt the spirits of the concubines through the duat, the underworld, ensuring they were constantly being tortured by executioner demons. It was a state-sponsored, eternal haunting. Why go to this extreme? It reveals a profound insecurity at the heart of the 20th dynasty. The state was so terrified that the concubines' dark magic might actually work from beyond the grave that they dedicated massive amounts of temple resources to keeping them dead. The worse-than-death element here is the realization that in ancient Egypt, there was no peace in the grave if you crossed the Pharaoh. You were hunted across the stars, through the clay, and into the very fire of the gods. Recent archaeological finds at Medinet Habu have uncovered a cache of these smashed red pots, buried directly under the doorway of the harem. It serves as a spiritual lock. Any woman entering or leaving that room for the next 100 years was literally walking over the pulverized souls of those who came before them. It was the ultimate psychological deterrent for the next generation of concubines. In the wake of the assassination of Ramesses III, the Canare, the institution once meant to be a sanctuary of divine beauty, was structurally and psychologically transformed. The new pharaoh, Ramesses IV, realized that the golden cage had become a breeding ground for treason because it was too intimate, too insular, and too reliant on Egyptian officials who could be swayed by family ties or romantic promises. The first major reform was the immediate removal of the local Egyptian guards. The trial had exposed that the overseer of the gate room was easily corrupted because he shared a cultural and linguistic bond with the concubines. To fix this, the state imported Shardana mercenaries, foreign sea warriors, known for their terrifying prowess, and more importantly, their lack of political investment in Egyptian court intrigue. These men didn't speak the language of the concubines, and they didn't care about Queen Tia's lineage. They were human locks, paid in gold and grain, to be the wall between the women and the world. For the concubines, this was a devastating shift. Their primary weapon, persuasion, and hekau, magic, was rendered useless against men who viewed them not as royal consorts, but as high-value cargo to be monitored. Archaeological surveys of later 20th dynasty palace remains show a distinct change in architecture. The open courtyards were walled off, and the number of entrances was reduced to a single, heavily guarded funnel point. Every item that entered every jar of wine, every bolt of linen, every reed for writing, was meticulously inspected and logged by royal scribes, who were held personally responsible for any contraband. The invisible hooks of retention were no longer just narrative, they were physical. This worse-than-death existence created a new kind of trauma. If the earlier Canare was a prison with the illusion of luxury, this new version was a bunker. The women were deprived of the one thing that had given them hope: the ability to plan for the future. In this militarized atmosphere, the screaming mummy's fate served as the ultimate pattern interrupt. Guards would allegedly tell stories of the prince wrapped in sheepskin to the new arrivals, ensuring that the first thing a young concubine learned wasn't how to sing for the pharaoh, but how to fear him. After this militarization, the historical record goes strangely silent. But does silence mean peace, or does it mean the surveillance was so successful that no one dared to even think of rebellion? Despite the militarized lockdown and the presence of Shardana mercenaries, the human spirit and the drive for agency found a way to breathe through the cracks of the 20th dynasty's surveillance. This was the era of the shadow economy, a secret trade network within the Canare that proved the concubines were far more than passive victims of the worse-than-death system. In an environment where your name was erased and your physical movements were tracked, information became the only currency that mattered. Scribes who were tasked with logging supplies often became the unwitting or bribed conduits for a black market of literacy. Concubines traded high-quality linen, imported perfumes, and gold jewelry for something much more dangerous: papyrus and ink. They weren't writing love letters, they were copying the very execration texts and hekau spells that the state used against them. By possessing these texts, they were attempting to build a spiritual shield against the pharaoh's soul-hunting rituals. This shadow economy wasn't just about goods, It was about memory resistance. We have evidence of counter-history being whispered in the dark. Younger concubines were told the true stories of Queen Ta and Prince Pentuer, not as the evil ones of the official records, but as rebels who almost broke the gods. This oral tradition served as a psychological lifeline. In a world that told them they were nameless and marked, knowing the true story of the 1155 BC conspiracy allowed them to maintain a sense of identity. They were participating in a conspiracy of memory that the Shardana mercenaries couldn't touch. The danger of this shadow economy extended to the men who facilitated it. Records from the later reign of Ramesses IX suggest a purge of palace scribes who were found with unexplained wealth. These men were subjected to the same nasal mutilation as the concubines, effectively merging the marked classes of the city. This shows that the harem's walls were porous, not for bodies, but for the corruption of the state's own bureaucracy. Think back to the screaming mummy who was left in a hidden cache. His story was never truly hidden. The shadow economy ensured that his agonizing face remained a symbol of both a warning and a possibility. The Egyptian state's control over the concubines did not end with their physical death or the mutilation of their names. To the pharaoh, ownership was eternal. This led to the chilling concept of the harem of the dead, a spiritual imprisonment enforced through the ritual of ka binding. In ancient Egyptian theology, the ka was the double or life force that required sustenance in the afterlife. For the loyal concubines, this meant a transition to a peaceful eternity. But for those caught in the web of the 1155 BC conspiracy, the state turned this theology into a weapon. Priests performed rituals designed to bind the ka of the conspirators to specific, isolated locations in the necropolis. By burying the execration figurines in deep, inaccessible shafts, they effectively anchored the spirits of these women to the earth. They were denied the ability to go forth by day, the freedom to travel between the underworld and the living world, which was the hallmark of a successful transition to the afterlife. They were, quite literally, ghosts in a divine prison. One of the most profound, worse-than-death indignities was the use of ushaptis. These were small servant figures meant to perform labor for the deceased in the afterlife. However, for the disgraced concubines, the state reversed this tradition. Records suggest that in the burials of some conspirators, the ushaptis were inscribed with commands that forced the woman's soul to serve the very pharaoh she had murdered. Imagine an eternity where, even as a spirit, you are magically compelled to weave linen and sing praises for the man you risked everything to kill. It was the ultimate systemic irony. Your rebellion in life resulted in an unbreakable servitude in death. This spiritual warfare reflects a deep-seated fear that the concubines' influence was so pervasive it could destabilize the heavens. By binding their souls, the 20th dynasty was attempting to quarantine a political virus. This is the universal truth. Power doesn't just want your obedience. It wants to own your why for all of time. The screaming mummy, Prince Pentuer, was also subject to this. By leaving his organs inside and wrapping him in sheepskin, they didn't just hurt his body. They weighed down his ka, ensuring he could never rise. He was meant to be the eternal gatekeeper of shame for the other concubines, the traitor's seed. In the cold logic of the 20th dynasty, the worse-than-death punishment could not stop with the women who held the daggers or the prince who sought the throne. To ensure the unbreakable continuity of the pharaoh's power, the state turned its eyes toward the future, the children of the concubines. If the beautiful ones were the trunk of the treasonous tree, their offspring were the seeds, and the Egyptian state was prepared to salt the earth. For the concubines involved in the 1155 BC conspiracy, their children, some of whom were the pharaoh's own biological offspring, suddenly became a biological liability. Under the clinical justice of Ramesses IV, a decree was enacted to strip these children of their royal status. They were no longer sons and daughters of the king. They were rebranded as the traitor's seed. This wasn't just a change in title. It was a systematic removal from the great list of names kept in the House of Life. In a single night, children who had been raised in the lap of luxury, wearing the finest linen and eating the purest food, were dragged from their beds and cast into a world that had been commanded to forget they existed. While the high-ranking Prince Pentuer was forced into a ritual suicide, the younger children and distant relatives of the concubines faced a slower, more grinding fate. Records suggest they were sent to the turquoise and copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula. These former royals were forced to labor in some of the most brutal conditions on Earth, where the heat was so intense it was said to melt the spirit. Just as the concubines were marked by nasal mutilation, their children were often branded on the shoulder with the sign of the rebel, a permanent scar that prevented them from ever escaping their lineage. They were forbidden from marrying or fathering children. The goal was the total biological termination of every branch of the families that had participated in the harem conspiracy. The absolute horror of this section lies in the fact that many of these children were the blood of Ramesses III. The state was effectively cannibalizing its own divinity to protect the throne. By treating the traitor's seed as filth, the new pharaoh was admitting that even the blood of a god could be corrupted by the ambition of a concubine. This brings us back to the macro loop of the screaming mummy. Pentaware's agonizing face wasn't just a punishment for him. It was a message to every child of the harem who survived. It said, "This is what happens to the branch that reaches too far." For 3,000 years, the pharaoh's decree of absolute erasure held firm. The desert sands of the Sinai and the hidden shafts of Thebes kept the secret of the traitor's seed and the mutilated concubines. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the clinical silence of the 20th dynasty was shattered by a series of accidental discoveries that reopened the most terrifying cold case in ancient history. In the rugged terrain near the ancient turquoise mines of Serabit el-Qadim, miners in the early 1900s stumbled upon a series of shallow, unmarked graves. Unlike the typical burials of Egyptian miners, which were often simple but respectful, these bodies showed signs of extreme physical trauma and systematic neglect. The skeletons belonged to individuals in their late teens and early 20s, yet their bone density was that of elderly laborers. Several of the remains exhibited the sign of the rebel, branding deliberate scarring on the shoulder blades that had been etched into the soft tissue during childhood. These individuals were buried without a single shabti, jar, or amulet, a worse-than-death omission that confirmed they were the traitor's seed, intended to be forgotten by the gods themselves. While the bodies in the Sinai told the story of the children, the discovery of the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1888 finally brought the screaming mummy, Prince Pentawere, into the light of modern science. When Gaston Maspero first unwrapped the sheepskin abomination, he noted a strange anomaly. The mummy had been placed alongside some of Egypt's greatest kings. This was a contradiction of the Damnatio Memoriae. Why would a traitor be hidden in the same secret tomb as his father, the man he helped murder? Modern DNA analysis has provided a chilling answer. The genetic ghost revealed that, even though the state tried to delete him, the priests who moved the royal mummies to protect them from tomb robbers still recognized the biological link. They couldn't bring themselves to throw away the body of a prince. So they kept him in a state of eternal arrest, forever beside the father he betrayed, frozen in his scream. The invisible hook of this cold case is that the pharaoh's plan for total erasure failed because of the very thing he tried to control: blood. DNA studies conducted in 2012 proved that unknown Mani was indeed the son of Ramesses III. The science did what the 20th dynasty priests couldn't. It gave the traitor his name back. Even more disturbing is the theory of the genetic ghost. Recent testing of modern populations in the areas near the ancient Sinai mines has shown traces of rare 20th dynasty royal haplogroups. It suggests that despite the forced labor and the branding, some of the traitor's seed survived long enough to pass on their DNA. The pharaoh's attempt to salt the earth was defeated by the sheer resilience of the nameless. While the judicial papyrus of Turin documents the clinical destruction of those caught within the palace walls, there is a chilling silence regarding those who were never found. This is the legend of the ghost harem, the small group of concubines and minor officials who, in the chaos of the pharaoh's assassination and the subsequent purge, managed to slip through the impossible defenses of the Medinet Habu gates. For a woman of the Kenere, the world outside the golden cage was as alien as the surface of the moon. Yet, records of military patrols from the late 20th dynasty mention unidentified female travelers moving toward the western oases, the remote, palm-fringed islands of green in the deep Sahara. These women were not just fleeing for their lives. They were fleeing from the worse than death, fate of nasal mutilation and spiritual erasure. They traded their royal jewelry necklaces of lapis lazuli and gold to nomadic Bedouins in exchange for passage across the Red Land. They became the first ghost harem, a community of women who had been legally deleted by the state, but remained physically alive in the harshest terrain on earth. What these women carried with them was more dangerous than gold. They carried the secret knowledge of the House of Women. This included the Hekau magic used in the conspiracy, but also advanced medical knowledge, complex agricultural techniques for linen production, and the true, unedited history of the Ramesside court. In the isolated settlements of Karga and Dakhla, archaeologists have found unusual 20th century pottery styles and weaving patterns that shouldn't exist in such remote outposts. It suggests that the ghost harem didn't just survive. They created a shadow court in exile. They kept the memory of the conspiracy alive, teaching their daughters that the pharaoh was not a god, but a man who could be bled by a woman with a plan. The irony of the ghost harem is that their existence forced the pharaoh to remain in a state of perpetual paranoia. For the rest of his reign, Ramesses IV sent soul hunters, elite trackers and priests into the desert to find these women. Every time a report came back of a mysterious woman in the desert, the palace went into a lockdown. The concubines had achieved the ultimate, worse-than-death victory. They had made the god king a prisoner of his own fear. We began this journey at the edge of a blade, a 3-inch wound in the neck of a god. We have traveled through the golden cage of the Canere, witnessed the clinical horror of nasal mutilation, and stood before the agonizing, a wide-mouthed scream of a prince who was never meant to be remembered. But as we close the macro loop of the 1155 BC harem conspiracy, we are left with a question that echoes louder than the screams. Why did the pharaoh go to such lengths to bury this story? The worse-than-death system was designed to be a total, multi-dimensional annihilation. The 20th dynasty utilized every tool at its disposal, legal, physical, and spiritual, to ensure that Queen Ta, Prince Pentawere, and their co-conspirators were deleted from the universe. They chiseled away the names, they smashed the red pottery of the soul, and they wrapped the royal blood in the filth of sheepskin. Yet, here we are, 3,000 years later, speaking their names. The screaming mummy was intended to be an anonymous pile of rot, an unknown Mani who would wander the underworld without eyes or a voice. Instead, through the miracle of modern forensic science and DNA analysis, he has become one of the most famous figures in Egyptology, a physical testament to the moment the God King was proven mortal. The very intensity of the pharaoh's effort to hide the truth is what eventually drew the world's attention back to it. This brings us to the third layer of our story, the universal truth. History is often defined as the narrative written by the victors, but this conspiracy proves that truth has a half-life that no tyrant can fully suppress. The concubines who fled into the ghost harem and the survivors who hid their names in their bandages understood something the pharaoh didn't. They understood that power is a performance, but memory is a seed. You can militarize the harem, you can brand the children, and you can salt the earth. But as long as one person remembers the true story, the impossible remains a possibility. The real horror of the Egyptian concubines wasn't just the daggers or the desert mines, it was the psychological terror of being told they didn't matter. But by uncovering these archaeological cold cases, we are performing the ultimate act of rebellion against the 20th dynasty. We are giving the nameless their names back. We are looking the screaming mummy in the eye and acknowledging the political trauma that froze his face in that position. The pharaoh Ramesses III died from a slit throat, but his legacy died the moment he had to resort to such grotesque cruelty to maintain his image. The women of the harem may have lost their lives, their noses, and their status, but in the end, they won the war of history. Their story is no longer a horrifying secret buried in the sand. It is a warning to every power structure that believes it can erase the human spirit. As you look at the sunset over the ruins of Medinet Habu today, remember that the silence of the stone is a lie. Beneath the grand reliefs and the empty cartouches, the whispers of the concubines still remain. They are the ghost harem that history couldn't catch. They are the truth that was far worse than death and far more resilient than an empire.